Maurice Bishop's attempt to reduce tensions between his country and Washington came to an end in this courtyard on October the 19th, 1983. He died here 6 days before the American invasion. A power struggle broke out in early October when Bernard Cord, Bishop's deputy, moved against him. Cord, with the support of the Grenadian Army, headed by General Hudson Austin, placed Bishop under house arrest. Grenada's ambassador in Washington was Decima Williams, a strong supporter of Maurice Bishop, who bitterly opposed his overthrow.
As soon as the public had wind that Bishop's leadership was being challenged and that Cord was not firmly on his side, the people smelt it, as we say, right away, and they said that this thing is not going to be successful. We're not going to support that.
Cord and Austin had badly underestimated Bishop's popularity. These pictures, recorded by an amateur photographer, show the Grenadian people taking to the streets to protest Bishop's arrest. Bishop was rescued and marched by his supporters to the Army headquarters at Fort Rupert, high above St. George's, Grenada's capital. Troops were dispatched to reclaim the fort. Gunfire broke out. Hundreds of terrified citizens jumped, many to their death, to avoid being shot. Bishop and at least 7 of his followers were seized by the military, lined up, and executed against this wall.
The People's Revolutionary Armed Forces have, as of 3 p.m. today, established a revolutionary military council.
The chaos ended only when General Hudson Austin took control and went on the radio to announce a 24-hour shoot-to-kill curfew.
That our major task at this moment is to protect and defend our country against any attack by imperialism. Anyone who seeks to demonstrate or disturb the peace will be shot.
The Reagan administration simply had an enormous piece of luck, if I may speak so bluntly, when Maurice Bishop was killed. Because without that murder, unknown in the Caribbean, violence is not known in the English-speaking Caribbean, there would not have been the support required for the Reagan administration to go into Grenada.
The students at the St. George's Medical School had always been insulated from the turbulence of local politics. Were these 600 Americans now threatened by the Grenadian government's self-destruction? Their safety would soon become the public rationale offered by the Reagan administration for the invasion of Grenada.
The danger aspect for the students came from the fact of the absence of assurances from any bona fide authorities. Every report that we got showed that there didn't seem to be much organization or discipline on the island, other than the fact that there was this curfew that was imposed throughout most of the day. And we didn't have any assurances. And the students were billeted in 3 campuses, and also some lived in the town. So there were 600 U.S. citizens in 4 different concentrations on this island. That gave cause for alarm. The thought early on crossed the minds of many people that it was a situation ripe for hostages.
Was that potential, you think, a decisive factor in the eventual decision to go in?
I think that absolutely the potential for taking a large number of hostages and the inability to get assurances that that would not happen, in my mind, was the driving force for the president's final decision.
If you were correct in your assumptions about what the Grenadians and Cubans might do, you could obviously have a very serious crisis.
Yes, I had less assumptions about the Cubans taking hostages, frankly. I don't think, at least the people I were talking with in Washington, believed that it would be likely that Castro would order taking hostages. But you had an island in ferment, you just had a...
Francis McNeill was abruptly dispatched to the Caribbean 2 days before the invasion to serve as the president's personal envoy. He made his recommendation within 12 hours of his arrival.
And you had a lot of Grenadans running around with guns, some of whom had been shooting indiscriminately. And it wasn't as if anyone had control of the island, and I thought there was a dangerous situation. My recommendation was that we go in, but if we go in quickly, or else we better look for other alternatives.
The curfew was effective. The island streets were deserted, and there was no more bloodshed. The Army, under Hudson Austin, was in control. But the general had no contact with the American government, and Washington had no first-hand knowledge of his intentions.
I don't believe Hudson Austin would have ordered the taking of American hostages. I don't believe that he would have taken any action to precipitate an American or a Caribbean military response to what was clearly a complete disaster inside the country. I believe that Austin would have tried to find a way out of the mess that he and several others had created. My information also suggests that that's what he did, that in fact he was involved in dialogue, in negotiations with the officers of the medical school.
One of General Austin's first acts was to reach out to the medical school. On the morning after the shooting, he visited the Vice Chancellor, Dr. Jeffrey Bourne.
The meeting I had with General Austin tended to reassure me that he had no intent of harming the students at that time, so that I felt that the students were not in any danger of a bunch of people going down there with guns and shooting them up. The fact that he was even prepared to open up the supermarket to get food for them was encouraging, and so that I did not feel there was an immediate urgency at that time.
The medical school officials remained skeptical of Austin's assurances.
At first we doubted his word. We kept testing him and testing him.
From his office in Bayshore, New York, the medical school chancellor, Charles Modica, spoke frequently with General Austin by telephone.
But in his own mind, it was very important that the school remain on the island and classes be held, and he was willing to do anything and everything to make sure that the students were safe and that the classes were held and that the employees' jobs were safeguarded. And we were cooperating with him, knowing that that was his goal.
Could you communicate this to our government?
Yes, I did communicate it to the State Department at that time.
The State Department chose not to consult with the chancellor, even though he had first-hand information and was directly responsible for the students.
Well, the State Department didn't give much credence to what I was saying, at least from my own point of view, and they intimated that they had their own sources, and their sources were probably much better than mine. And thanks for calling, and I was questioning whether they were even taking any of the information I was giving them at any higher level at a few different points in time.
Did you know that the school was in contact with General Hudson Austin during this period?
There were some indications that some authorities from the school may have been talking to what they considered to be Grenada officials. Whether there was an indication that they talked to General Austin specifically, I don't recall. There was an attempt on the part of the school, I think, to talk with what they considered to be the authorities on the island. Obviously, if the school was on the island, it obviously had contact with many Grenadans. I would find it strange if they didn't talk with people.
The medical school was represented in Washington by the Vice Chancellor's son, Peter Bourne. He'd been a senior White House official in the Carter administration.
What I think is truly extraordinary is that the Reagan administration and the State Department failed to take advantage of this extraordinary source of information that they had through the medical school. They had my father there in Grenada. They had Charles Modica in Bayshore in regular contact with Grenada. They had myself here in Washington. And yet nobody in the Reagan administration made any effort to contact us to get information that could have been helpful. This is in very, very sharp contrast to what happened in 1979 when the Gary regime was overthrown in Grenada. Again, you had a period of time when communications were cut through the usual channels, and the State Department, the National Security Council, took tremendous advantage of the access that the medical school had. Messages were passed through me and through Charles Modica to Grenada. We were able to check on the safety of Peace Corps volunteers who were out in the rural areas of Grenada. and the contrast between the way it was handled in '79, utilizing this resource, and the complete absence of any attempt to use it by the Reagan administration is just striking. And to me, there is no other conclusion that I can draw other than that they were just not interested in the information.
You're satisfied that the government pursued all other options prior to invasion and that it knew enough about the island to make a judgment that invasion was necessary?
I'm fully satisfied that we took every step that we could possibly take in trying to work the peaceful evacuation of those citizens prior to making the recommendation to the President, his acceptance of the decision that we now proceed with force. Under the situation of what we knew, the time frame in which we were working, I am totally satisfied that we took every possible step.
As planning for a military invasion of Grenada intensified, President Reagan and his Secretary of State traveled to Augusta, Georgia, to keep a previously scheduled golf outing. They acted as if nothing was out of the ordinary. But the President had secretly ordered that a 10-ship U.S. Navy task force en route to Lebanon be diverted to the waters off Grenada. Early on Sunday, October 23rd, as the Joint Chiefs of Staff were hastily pulling together their plan for the invasion of Grenada, tragedy struck in the Middle East. 241 American Marines were killed in a terrorist bombing attack in Beirut. Their deaths did not derail the planning for Grenada. Leslie Janka was the press officer for the National Security Council.
Both the Lebanon involvement of the United States and the Grenada incursion reflected a sense of the Reagan administration from the very beginning that it was time to show, in the administration's word, that America was back, that we were cured of the post-Vietnam syndrome of the use of military force, of America taking strong diplomatic action. But a far more important overlap of the two events was the fact that almost as a cover for the Grenada operation was the blowing up of the Marine barracks in Beirut, and the tragedy in Lebanon kept a lot of people focused on that issue and allowed the planning and the development of activities to go on for Grenada.
36 hours after the Beirut bombing, the President convened a final meeting. He had already authorized reconnaissance operations against Grenada and had learned that 4 men had drowned attempting to infiltrate the island.
The presidential decision came down finally on, the final meeting was on Monday night, October 24th, Monday, about 5 or 6 o'clock. The meeting took place in the Situation Room in the White House with the President in the chair. Present were the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the National Security Advisors, 2 or 3 or 4 more. Each one of them gave their appropriate briefings. There were some questions raised by some of the members, exploratory, not aggressive type of questions. To the point, the President made a couple of questions himself. The President then asked if there were any other questions, any other comments. And there ensued a silence that probably lasted 30 seconds, but to me lasted like 5 minutes. Because in the final analysis, it's the President that has to make that decision. And after this silence, he said, okay, let's go.
The operation was given a code name, Urgent Fury. American military bases from Florida to the state of Washington had been put on alert over the weekend and began to mobilize.